we are going to be talking today about avoiding English language errors, writing for acceptance. So some of the common English language errors that international colleagues who write English as a native language, also colleagues who do not write English as a native language, do tend to make. So just in a few minutes, we'll get started. It's just past the hour. I see that we have a number of attendees joining us today from all over the world. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to give this presentation. Let me just make sure that you are able to use the chat box. I think that's very important. If you would like to ask a question, you of course can ask a question at any time in the chat box. And please do keep in mind that we will be sharing the recording of this presentation with everybody who attends the session, and also everybody who attends the session will of course also have access to a certificate at the end. So thank you once again for joining us today. Writing English language, writing for acceptance, avoiding those common English language mistakes. We are a Research Square company founded in 2004. So far, we have supported more than 2.5 million authors in almost 200 countries through our preprint server. So if you haven't had the chance to have a look at the preprint server, researchsquare.com, I do encourage you to have a look at the Research Square preprint server, as well as our suite of manuscript preparation services on aje.com. So researchsquare.com and aje.com, we work with a number of publishers all over the world, including our friends and colleagues at Bentham Science publishers. Right, let's get into it. Thank you so much for joining us once again today. It is important to remember that you can improve your English writing skills. English communication, it's a skill, not a talent. And as well, because we edit so many papers all of the time, thousands upon thousands of papers every week, at aje.com, you are able to avoid common mistakes. So even the mistakes that authors most often make, I'll talk you through some of those in this session today. You can improve your writing. English communication, it's a skill, not a talent. And you can, of course, as well, learn to avoid common mistakes that many authors make. So let's get into it. Let's talk about our readers. Our readers are the most important people in academic publishing. We don't write papers in order to put them on the wall, to stick them up in our offices. We write papers so that other people are going to read our work and cite our papers. Very, very important. So here's a few facts about our readers as academic researchers. Our readers don't have much spare time to read anything. Most articles will not be essential reading. Most academics around the world want to read papers quickly. They're going to get frustrated if they struggle to understand your ideas. So facts about your readers, the people for whom you are writing your academic papers: no time to read. Most of the articles that they read will not be essential reading. People want to read papers quickly, and they're going to get frustrated if they struggle to understand your ideas. So keep those in mind. Keep these facts about your readers in mind as you begin to think about writing your paper. Very, very, very important. And what is the function of writing a paper in the first place? Why do we write academic papers? Why do we do that? Well, we do that to explain new information. We do this so that we can pass on new information to our readers. So your academic papers explain new information for readers to remember and use. Readers will remember your information in your papers if you use a number of key strategies to make your English clear and effective, in order that readers will be able to use the new information that you present in your articles. So we have to think initially as academic writers about our readers, and we have to think about why we share our research, why we do this, why we put academic papers out into the wider world in the first place. Now, keep in mind, when we're thinking about writing papers in English, good writers use 3 important learning principles. They're aware of cognitive load theory, they are aware of cognitive bias, and they are aware of reader expectations. So be aware of this as a researcher. This is very important as well when you think about what to do as a researcher with your academic papers. Right. Good writers use 3 important learning principles. Cognitive load theory, that's how much new information can your readers be expected to process. Cognitive bias, that's where we don't want in our writing to assume that our readers know everything that we know about the academic paper, and as well those reader expectations, making sure that you do present information in your papers in a logical and easy to understand way. So what should you aim for as a writer? Well, here's some goals for you to aim for as an English language writer. 10 to 20 words per sentence and 1 idea in each sentence. We want to see a variety of shorter and longer sentences in your writing, and varying the sentence length, of course, makes your writing interesting, but aiming for 10 to 20 words per sentence and 1 idea per sentence as well. So only using punctuation, semicolons if necessary, and making sure that you do thoroughly explain your ideas to readers. Do not use words in your academic writing that do not add value to your idea. And here's a simple rule for you to follow. Can you delete a word from an English sentence without changing the meaning of that sentence? If yes, then delete the word. One great way to do this, of course, is to read your work out loud to a mirror, to your dog, to your cat, to make sure that it makes sense, and also to have a think about whether you can delete words from your English sentences without changing the meaning. So here are some examples of words that do not add value to presented ideas. It is well known that most of the intense diffraction peaks. As a matter of fact, we found higher expression levels of. A number of studies have shown that neuronal migration is. Can you see the words in these sentences that could be deleted from these sentences without changing the meaning of the sentence? I wonder if you can see which of these words could be deleted from these phrases without changing the overall meaning of the sentence. I think it is relatively obvious that you would be able to edit these sentences down. It is well known that is a very common wasted word series that lots of English writers use. As a matter of fact, you don't need that either. A number of studies have shown that if you're citing some studies after the phrase neuronal migration is, as you can see in this sentence here, we don't need to write a number of studies have shown that at the start of the sentence. So deleting it is well known that most of the intense diffraction peaks. As a matter of fact, we found higher levels of expression of. A number of studies have shown that. Just delete it. Neuronal migration is, and keep your sentences short. So deleting unnecessary words is a good starting point to keep your English language clear and easy to understand. You can also change your use of words. That is another reason why becomes therefore we believe. In order to becomes to evaluate academic integrity. despite the fact that becomes although. It is clear that becomes clearly the surface modification was. Ways to avoid unnecessary words in your writing. And also, you can learn to use adverbs. It was evident that, evidently. It was possible that, possibly. It is interesting to note that, notably. It was obvious to conclude, obviously. So rather than writing out in full phrases like it was possible that, you can use an adverb to make your sentences shorter. So good English writing follows a pyramid structure from general to more specific. This is especially the case when you're putting together the introduction to your articles. You want people interested in your papers. You want people to read your papers. You want people to think, this is a very interesting paper. I'm going to read more. So begin your papers with general information. Begin your papers to hook people into the article. If you're working on something very specific and your paper is about something very specific, talk about that later. Initially, bring the reader into the article by talking about the larger, wider context of your study. So, for example, if you're working on pollution in soil, don't start your paper by talking about the specific chemical reactions that you're actually working on. Talk about the bigger issue, chemical pollution in soil. Build the article down so that you keep people interested. Using short sentences, no unnecessary words, familiar words, active voice rather than the passive voice, an appropriate style, good punctuation, and conciseness in your English writing. The most common mistakes that people do tend to make in their English writing include plagiarism, tenses and switches, the use of spelling conventions, and the use of inappropriate words. If you know about these common English mistakes, you are less likely to make them in your own writing. So let's have a quick look at some of these. What is plagiarism? Well, we always try to avoid it. Of course we do. This is simply where you take another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving proper credit. This is academically dishonest, of course. We have to do our own work. We need to cite sources. You can't take information out from somebody else's paper and just use it without citation. We're all aware of that. We all know about that. We don't do that because we're good researchers. We cite our sources. But self-plagiarism happens often, unfortunately, in academic writing. And this is where you take some of your own previous text, articles, research results, figures, tables from some of your own previous publications and use them again in a later paper. And lots of academics, lots of researchers are simply unaware that they should not be doing this. You can't use a data set from a previous study without making the reader aware. You can't submit a manuscript for publication containing data that have already been published, even in your own papers. And of course, you can't publish multiple similar papers about the same study in different journals. That's called salami slicing, and it's a bit naughty. We put together this handy checklist for the common forms of academic plagiarism, mosaic plagiarism. That's where you take data from various sources and mix them all up together to make the new text in your paper seem original. Don't do it. Cite your sources. Don't do mosaic plagiarism. Don't do paraphrasing plagiarism. This is where you rewrite the paper, you change the words, but you don't cite the original source. Even if the words differ, the idea remains the same and plagiarism occurs. Finally, self-plagiarism. Very common simply because lots of people are unaware that it is an issue. This is where you fail to cite your own previous work, even if you're simply revising an old idea or a previously published observation. Keep that in mind as well. How to avoid it? Well, you read something in a second or third language, and then without thinking, you use it in your own writing. It's important to consider getting your documents evaluated by a plagiarism checking service before submission, keeping careful records of all your reference sources, using reference management tools, EndNote, Mendeley, the fantastic Edance My Manuscript tool, and also make sure you consider getting in touch with us. We can run your paper through a plagiarism check before you make your submissions. If you don't do it, your journal is definitely going to do it. So you don't want a score in your article of 10% or more. And here you can see what a plagiarism check looks like. This one failed, 32%. You do need to make sure that you are less than 10% with your papers, or your journal, your target journal, is going to reject your paper prior to peer review. So that's mistake number one, issues with plagiarism. Mistake number two that people do tend to make in their English academic writing is the use of tenses. So don't get tense. Remember your readers. Think about your readers and how they will experience your paper. As we discussed a little bit earlier, getting your message across clearly and simply is often more important than being correct. So one of the most common questions that we get asked in our events, in our training, which tense to use for different sections of my paper. Remember, your readers, they are experiencing your paper in real time, so most of it should be written in the present tense. Keep it simple. The introduction, discussion, results, mostly in the present tense. The materials and methods happened in the past, so you will be talking about them in the simple past tense. Of course, it can get more complicated in the discussion when you talk about future research, but generally speaking, keep your writing simple and easy to follow. What about mistake number three? Well, that's the use of different spelling conventions in your articles. Don't forget that journals will often specify whether they want you to use American English or British UK English in the text of your paper, or they may not specify. They may just say keep the writing consistent. So make sure you are following the aims and scopes, the author instructions, or at least keeping your spelling consistent, because nothing bothers an editor more than you switching spellings of color, of organization, of recognize, analyze, for example, within the same paper. So keep your spelling consistent throughout. English, British English can be hard to decode sometimes. I only have a few minor comments. Might really mean, please rewrite the paper completely. It's not bad. Might really mean it's good and very interesting. May really mean the work is clearly nonsense. Verbs, verbs, verbs. Active voice. Our journals prefer authors to write in the active voice. We recommend when writing your paper, use the active voice where possible. This is the case at international journals these days, and it always has been the case that active voice and active writing is the better way to get your message across simply and easily to international journals. We have incorporated, I collected, our team surveyed, we analyzed. Subject is a recipient of a verb's action in the passive voice, whereas in the active voice, the subject acts upon the verb. That's the difference. So in a passive voice sentence, the earthquake was detected. Whereas in the active voice sentence, we detected an earthquake. Now, it's often easier to get your message across. It's easier to be understood in the active voice. We evaluated the models comparing the economic growth and diversification of the Middle East and East Asia. The models comparing the economic growth and diversification of the Middle East and East Asia were evaluated. I would say it's easier to understand in the active voice sentences written in the active voice are more simple, more direct, and easier to read. In this example, the models comparing the economic growth and diversification of the Middle East and East Asia were evaluated. What was being evaluated? Who was doing the evaluation? It's not clear. People often ask, well, isn't this a new thing in academic writing? Not at all. Have a look at this one from 1953. Maybe you've seen this paper. Maybe you've heard of this paper. Watson and Crick, Molecular Structure of Nucleic Acids. We wish to suggest a structure for the salt of deoxyribose nucleic acid, DNA. Active voice, paper in Nature, 1953. So you're not doing something that's new and different. And indeed, as you can see here, different journal writing guides, different international style guides for academic writing, AMA, APA, Chicago, ACS, IEEE. In general, authors should use the active voice. Use the active voice, less wordy and more direct. Wherever possible, use active verbs that demonstrate what is being done and who is doing it. So, you may have been taught to write in the passive voice. In your academic writing, in your English academic papers, we would encourage you, journals would encourage you, it's easier to get your message across and to be understood if you write in the active voice. Here's Nature. Nature journals prefer authors to write in the active voice. When writing the manuscript, use the active voice where possible. That's the American Academy of Ophthalmology, their journal there, Ophthalmology. Active voice sentences, easier to understand. Studies have shown that readability and comprehension are better for active voice sentences. Passive voice sentences require more brain activity to understand them. So if you don't believe me, there's some real cognitive psychology, brain science that shows that active voice is easier to understand. So researchers use it. Here's a few examples. You'll find this is the case if you look at recent articles in your favorite journals, in those high impact factor journals we have incorporated. We examined, it is most common. However, should you always use the active voice? Should you always avoid the passive voice? No, passive voice can be useful in certain situations, avoiding repetition. If you want to paraphrase, unclear relationships in your method section, and in terms of sentence structure. 75% active voice, 25% passive voice would be a typical breakdown of your average academic paper. And let's move on. Let's have a look at some examples of where it could be good to use the passive voice. Decreased LDL cholesterol levels were observed with the Mediterranean diet. This implies that decreased LDL cholesterol could be due to many causes. That's what I want to say. Decreased LDL cholesterol levels were observed with the Mediterranean diet. If I rewrite that sentence into the active voice, the Mediterranean diet had decreased levels of LDL cholesterol. Active voice writing, in this case, implies decreased LDL cholesterol. So in this situation, we do not want the active voice, we want the passive voice to avoid any confusion. Use of the passive voice in medical journal articles. These researchers evaluated 30 articles published in 2006 from 3 journals: JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, and The Lancet. Here's the breakdown: 80%, 74%, 77% active voice in the writing. In the text of these papers, 20%, 26%, 23% passive voice. So 2/3 of your paper, try to write it in the active voice. The beaker was filled with water and then was placed on the Bunsen burner. I filled a beaker with water and placed it on the Bunsen burner. The whole length of the highway was paved by the crew. The crew paved the whole length of highway. Active voice is easier to understand and requires less words. Lastly, then, some other common mistakes that people do tend to make in their English writing. Don't start sentences with coordinating conjunctions or fragments. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. These are bad words to start your sentences with. Don't use abbreviations or acronyms to start sentences. DNA data were collated. We collated DNA data. And numbers. 8 data points. A total of 8 data points. Avoid the use of numbers to start your sentences. Words to avoid. Don't use emotional words. You can't develop a logical argument using emotional words. Crank, sound, good, correct, superior, and don't use superlatives in your writing either. Out of place in your scientific writing. Gigantic, earth-shattering, magnificent, marvelous, and fantastic. These kinds of words are out of place in academic writing. Don't try to qualify the absolute. Adjectives are absolute often and cannot be modified, so a petri dish is either sterile or not sterile. It can't be very sterile, quite sterile, or fairly sterile. An object is simply unique, not very, quite, or fairly unique. Other adjectives have to be qualified with care. For example, pregnancy. You can be recently pregnant, but you can't be slightly pregnant. Beware of those misplaced modifiers and problematic pronouns. Mistakes when you use these can be confusing, misleading, or just plain funny. Using multiple regression techniques, the animals in experiment 1 were. In assessing the damage, the plants exhiberated numerous lesions. The spiders were inadvertently discovered while repairing a faulty growth chamber. That's what I've written. What does it sound like? It's long been known that, correct to an order of magnitude, almost reached significance at the 5% level. Text is easier to understand if you use simple words and phrases. So avoid phrases that imply sloppy thinking and be careful with your use of that and which. These two words can help make your intended meanings and relationships unmistakable, but keep in mind, if the clause can be omitted without leaving the modified noun incomplete, use which and enclose the clause within commas or parentheses. Otherwise, use that. So the lawnmower that is broken, so is the lawnmower that works. The lawnmower which is broken is in the garage. So a simple rule to follow for your use of that versus which. And finally, avoid redundant words. We talked earlier about how you can delete words from your sentences if they are unnecessary. Small in size, rectangular in shape, blue in color, tenuous in nature. No need for these words. Avoid them. That man is blue, rather than that man is blue in color. Maintaining a formal tone in your academic writing is very important, but this does not involve the use of English as we would normally speak it. Don't use jargon, don't use specialized meanings, and don't use unique conventions. Deviating from a formal tone will make your academic writing stand out to reviewers and editors. So have a look at this. Don't use possessive forms. Don't use contractions, and try to avoid the use of informal words and phrases in your academic writing. And metaphors. No metaphors. Don't use metaphors. Don't use similes in your writing. Metaphors, of course, are words or phrases applied to an object or action to which it's not literally appropriate. Life is a highway. Love is a battlefield. If music be the food of love, play on. So, in conclusion, 2 things to remember about your English academic writing. You can improve. English communication is a skill, not a talent. You can learn to avoid common mistakes in your writing, even the mistakes that authors often do make. We provide a roadmap for academic writing and publishing, preparing to write, selling yourself, structuring your writing, and using effective writing skills. There are some simple rules that you can follow in your English academic writing that can make a huge difference. We are Research Square Company. Have a look at our digital editing tool. It can edit your papers in less than 10 minutes. resources.aje.com/digital editing web will give you a free 30-day trial of our digital editing tool. So have a look at the link on the screen there, resources.aje.com/digital editing web. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we have talked about English language skills. We do provide a range of English language editing services at our company aje.com. You can get in touch with me. My name's Gareth Dyke. Discount code there on the screen, 10% off all of our AJE services. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation today.